Okay, good morning, everybody. And I repeat Hans's welcome to you. I'm Mike Pothier from the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office, and we're co-hosting this webinar this morning with the Hans Seidel Foundation. I want to start by welcoming in particular our two speakers, Professor Markus Beckmann, who is the Chair of Corporate Sustainability Management at the Friedrich-Alexander-Universität in Erlangen-Nürnberg in Germany, and is speaking to us this morning from Berlin. And then our own Trevor Manuel, well known to all of us, I'm sure, very long-serving minister in the administration from 1994 up until 2014. The format of our webinar this morning is a little bit strange, but we are trying to keep it fairly dynamic. And so we will have two inputs from each speaker. Professor Beckmann will give an initial input, roughly 10 or 12 minutes, on the origins and the background and the context of the social market economy. He will include in that some questions to you and explain to you how you can go about answering those questions. And then we will ask Trevor to respond briefly to those initial remarks. Thereafter, Professor Beckmann will give the second part of his presentation, which he has titled The Sub-Constitutional Issues, looking in particular at the role of the state, the welfare system, the parameters that the state sets for the social market economy. And then once again, we'll ask for a brief response to that from Trevor, looking in particular then at the context under which the South African state operates. I should say at the outset, no one is attempting to prescribe the social market economy as a solution or a model for South Africa to follow. What we are trying to do is to explore the possibilities. We know very well that our economy needs help in various ways. We know very well what the problems are, the unemployment, the poverty, the inequality, etc., etc. So this is an attempt to potentially learn from one example that's out there, not an attempt on behalf of CPLO or the Hans Seidel Foundation to say that this is something which ought to be followed. So that'll be the format. We will do our very best to then open everything up to questions and answers from you for the remainder of the meeting, which I hope will be at least 45 minutes. We have a very large number of participants. It's just gone over 60 at the moment. We had 150 people registering, and no doubt many more will join. So it will be challenging to organize the Q&A. We'll do our best. If you can use the chat function on Zoom to do that, to pose your questions and your comments, so much the better. It also allows us to keep a good record of them. And the two speakers can also see then, without you having to voice the question or the comment, what is being said. But having said that, I will try to bring in voice questions and comments as well to the extent that I can. I think you also will know about the raise your hand function, which you can find down on the right-hand side of the screen in the bottom right corner. That's another good way of getting noticed. I'm sure many of you are very adept at using Zoom, but maybe some of us aren't quite used to it yet. It will help also if you format your question and your comment beforehand and even write it down so that we do not have to have long speeches that end with a fairly simple question at the end. We need to conserve time as much as we can. I'd also just like to repeat the earlier request that you switch off, apart from the speakers and Hans, obviously, if the rest of you can switch off your video, that helps to conserve the bandwidth a little bit and just makes the quality of everything slightly better. We, as the hosts, will try to switch off your videos for you if you can't manage it yourself. An important part of this discussion comes at the end, but I'd like you to think about it now and once again use the chat function for this. What do we do afterwards? It's all very well having a nice discussion, but what do we do with it afterwards? There is a possibility of further discussions, perhaps more focused and more thematic on this topic, on aspects of this topic in the future. potentially even some sort of a mini conference. I know the Hans Seidel Foundation has some interest in that. So if you have those ideas, and if you'd like to be kept informed about them, please do let us know by posting a comment or a question or a suggestion. I think that's probably enough for me. Now I'm going to hand over briefly to Hans Buehler, the resident representative of the Hans Seidel Foundation in South Africa, for a little bit of scene setting. Hans?
Thank you very much, Mike. Colleagues, friends of the Hans Seidel Foundation, excellencies, yeah, thank you very much to all of you for joining us today. I think now when we are sitting at level 2 lockdown and the opening of the economy, this is certainly good news for many businesses in South Africa, livelihoods and the economy in general. But, and I think we all know this, and especially when I've gone through the list of participants, we have many economists sitting with us today, political decision makers and interested citizens. All of us know that South Africa is facing an enormous economic decline, not only caused by the COVID pandemic, but certainly reinforced by it. And we can see it on the streets and we can read about it every day in the news. People are suffering and people are getting angry. You all know the tragic figures when we talk about unemployment, debt, state budget deficit or inequality. They're all rising. And fact is, the current development trajectory is increasingly untenable. And the country is steadily falling further behind its global peers compared to other middle-income countries. And while there has been obviously important progress, economic empowerment has not been working in the way it was envisioned in 1994. But I think, and I think we all think that, there's still hope and things could change for the better. For example, a long-term forecast of the Institute for Security Studies states, and I quote here, if the government successfully uses the coronavirus crisis to build a pro-growth social compact and implements evidence-based economic policies, South Africa's economy could, by 2044, be almost 50% larger than the current path forecast for that year. 50% larger if economic-based and evidence-based policies are being implemented. That's a massive difference. Therefore, some South African experts and some politicians, I believe, see in this crisis an opportunity to implement long-needed reforms. President Cyril Ramaphosa speaks about a new economic model for South Africa. And although many experts would also argue it is quite clear what needs to be done to get the economy going, and I think Mike has alluded to it, there is certainly no silver bullet. Many obvious and necessary strategies have been outlined in the past, sometimes even put in official documents, but it seems that they keep being either distracted or not being implemented at all, whether because of political interference, power battles, or an ineffective public sector. Not only in South Africa, but in many countries around the world, there is the never-ending debate between socialists and capitalist ideas and ideology. It seems that in times of crisis, these ideological battles are increasing. But when we talk about economic policies in general, there is much more than only those two concepts. And this is the reason why, together with the CPLO, we as Hans Seidel Foundation thought it is a good time to contribute to the current discussions in South Africa with an exchange of experiences between South Africa and Germany on the topic of the so-called social market economy. A concept which is responsible for the economic success in Germany after World War II. And you all know that the distraction in Europe and the horror was caused by us Germans. It was this concept, the social market economy, was developed by economists and politicians after Germany was almost completely destroyed. In the 40s and 50s, where people had no jobs, where hunger was present everywhere and always, where infrastructure was lacking. And the major question experts and politicians had to answer was, how do you create an economic system that can provide the basis for prosperity, social cohesion, and democracy? And in my opinion, maybe most important, to prevent the horrors of dictatorship which Germany experienced. And they came up with the social market economy, maybe one of the biggest success stories ever when you look where Germany stands nowadays, being the economic powerhouse of Europe. And as Mike and myself, I think we said it twice now, there are no silver bullets for the economic challenges South Africa is facing. And there's obviously also no blueprint which can be copied. Context is different, no doubt about it. But we can learn from each other and we can share this experience. And therefore, I'm especially grateful to former Minister Trevor Manuel and Professor Beckmann, our two speakers today. For now, I look very much forward to your inputs and the discussions with the many experts participating in the session. Please let us know if this is a topic which should be further pursued. And last but most importantly, thank you to the CPLO, to Father Peter John, who's with us also, for the long-standing and trustful cooperation, and Mike for chairing the session. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Hans. I'm going to go straight over to Markus. Take it away.
Thank you very much. I hope that you can see my presentation. It's a privilege and honor. Thanks for to the organizers. I would like to jump right into the content and start by the title. The Social Market Economy, a Model for South Africa. Now the second part, a model for South Africa. First disclaimer, I can actually not answer that. You have to, the audience, debate. The first part, I also have to start with a disclaimer. The social market economy in Germany is actually many, many things, and I'm not presenting what the social market economy is, but what my perspective is on it. And I do that as a business ethicist. And as most people don't know what that is, let me start with a very short challenge that you might know. This might get your thinking going by looking at the following problem. You see the following 9 dots, and your task is to combine them by drawing 4 lines without making a break. So you start one line, another line. Can you do that and actually connect the 9 dots by drawing 4 lines? And my experience is, you can do that later at home, that most people struggle doing that. And why do we struggle? Because when we look at that picture, most of us actually have a frame in mind, and they see that there is a box, and that box frames the search for the solution. And the moment you start searching for a solution within that frame, without reflecting what you implicitly bring to the table, the notions you have in the background, it actually becomes impossible to solve that problem. Now, how does the solution get possible? And there are actually many solutions out there. One is to start here and then go there, and there. But all those solutions presuppose that we first think out of the box, that we reflect our ideas and think differently about them. Now, in the past, I did a mistake. I had on my slide the text that says, the solution is to think outside the box. Now that's not true, because you can think outside the box and do many strange things outside the box. They don't solve the problem. But if you want to find a solution for certain complex problems, it's required to first reflect upon your frames. And that is what I'm trying to do as a business ethicist, to look at normative debates, see how we think about them, and see whether different kind of framings have different contributions in looking and finding a solution. Now that was my introduction. I hope it was short enough to show you that I'm not an expert in fiscal and monetary policy, but I would like to engage in a debate about how we can learn in complex situations. Now the concept I want to look at today is the social market economy, and it does have a history and a background. And I briefly want to start with that, because if you ask Germans why the social market economy is so important, some know, but not all of us actually know, that they go back to almost 100 years ago, when in the 1920s we had drastic, enormous economic crisis with hyperinflation. Sorry, now here I have the wrong, this is Zimbabwe. I wanted to have the one from Germany. Actually, we had the exact same bill. I forgot to include the second one, 100 trillion Deutschmarks in 1923. We had the crisis of the Great Depression, which led to huge unemployment rates. And those economic crises translated into political crises. We had in Berlin, where I live, if I look out of the window, there were streets where people were engaging in violent conflict on the streets. And you all know that in Germany, that actually ended not only in crisis, but eventually in catastrophe with the rise of Hitler, which led to the demise of German civilization, the horrors of the Holocaust, war that led to the destruction of Germany and many other countries that were havocked by it, and also Germany experienced refugees. So Germany was in a bit of despair situation. And I'm saying that because the German social market economy actually tries to reflect what can we learn from this experience and how can we move forward. And here I want to introduce three selectively chosen fathers of the German market economy. Most Germans know Ludwig Erhard. He was the Minister of Economics, who actually was the father of the economic miracle. And he actually relied on Müller-Armack, who was the one who coined the term social market economy. But the very ideas behind that actually came from other people as well, such as Walter Eucken, and I will briefly look at him. Because both Eucken and Armack had an idea in mind, and that was the idea, how can we reconstruct a society that is actually in ruins? And for Müller-Armack, that was the idea of how can we create peace in a society that was seriously polarized. And Eucken, his wife, had a Jewish mother. He deeply felt, how can we actually save civilization in Germany? So they had different roles, and they all contributed to a debate after Germany then was in the process or started to reconstruct, what should we do? And this was actually a constitutional question, because in Germany at the time, as of 1945, we saw two different answers to the same question. What kind of economic system do we want to have in our country? And in East Germany, we saw central planning with a socialist economy. And in West Germany, the question was, do we do this, socialist economy, capitalism, or do we have our own answer to find a solution to the question that Hans already mentioned? How can we create an economic system that allows for prosperity, but also for democracy and for social cohesion? And Germany was at the crossroads, and this is what I call the constitutional question. What kind of options do we choose to organize the state, the market, and particularly now the market compared to central planning or other options? And that was a short introduction of the history and where I come from. And before I try to sketch an answer of what the social market economy is, I would like to include your voices first. This is an experiment. We don't know whether it will work. We prepared an online voting opportunity, which you will find on menti.com. So if you take out your smartphone and enter www.menti.com, you will be prompted to enter a code. You can also open a separate browser window, but then you will ask to enter a code, and that code is 7385226. If you do that, you will see three questions, three statements where you're asked whether you strongly disagree or whether you strongly agree. And they relate to that constitutional question, how do we build an economic system in the first place? Do you think that the market economy in general is just and fair? And here you can strongly disagree or strongly agree. Do you think that the market economy in South Africa is just and fair? Do you strongly agree or disagree? And do you think that economic justice in South Africa is currently increasing if we look at the current situation in the past years? And we do see that two people have already responded. You see their votes coming in. And what we also see is that not everybody has the same opinion. We can see who's saying what. I know that this is a new tool. So in order to allow yourself to familiarize with it, maybe you take another minute to see whether it works for you. It's an invitation. You don't have to use that. But we do see that we already have 13 people who went to menti.com, enter it into your browser, either on the phone or on your laptop in a separate window, enter the code 7385226, and then you can enter your answers. Now, what we do see is that not only we see that there is like an average opinion, but we see the diversity of the group. When we ask, is the market economy in general just and fair, we see some who say they strongly agree, but also many who say they strongly disagree. If you look at the perspective on the market economy in South Africa, it's actually a bit more critical even, with nobody saying it's they strongly believe it's just and fair. And if we look at the last part, is economic justice in South Africa increasing? Nobody thinks that strongly agree that it increases, and most people actually feel that economic justice is decreasing or not increasing. That was the question. So that brings us to the next question: what can we actually do? And that's basically the situation that the social market economy founding fathers faced in 1940 and 1950. So let me ask a final question for the moment. If we want to make the economy more just, for those of you who say that it's not superbly just and fair, and particularly in South Africa, what do we need? Do we rather need a stronger market, or do we need a stronger state? And we have the first two people who decided we need to strengthen the state, but also people who say, no, we need to strengthen the market. And the majority here right now seems to favor a stronger state. But many people say, no, we have to strengthen the market. And that is also reflecting a debate that the fathers of the social market economy knew very well. So I thank you very much. I think this first time I've used with such a diverse audience of people I didn't know a tool, and it works really well. So thank you very much. We might come back to that voting later. You can still cast your vote. No voice should be lost in that regard. So why have I done that? I wanted to show you, now these are the questions, that the questions the fathers of the social market economy cared about, those questions, are still relevant for us today in the debate. And now let's see what the answer to the question was in the founding hour when the question was to choose an economic system and to gain support for it in Germany. Now that is what I call the constitutional perspective. If we look at that history, I want to focus a bit more on Walter Eucken. He's an interesting person, and also I learned a lot about him from my PhD supervisor. So much of the work that I'm presenting here is based on the work of Ingo Pies, just to be transparent about that. Now, Eucken had something in mind that I know resonates with the debate in South Africa, and that was something like the idea of a social compact. If we want to have a society that comes together at one table, it should be a compact that all citizens can agree upon. Now, this is the American Declaration of Independence, but just the idea of a social compact. Now, if you take that seriously, you need to have an acknowledgement of what the people actually want. And here, Eucken tried to analyze what are the preferences of the people, and if there are polarizations, what are the different values pursued here? And he analyzed that this is expressed in the so-called soziale Frage, the social question of the time, and there were actually several variants. The first variant was with the increase of the Industrial Revolution, the rise in inequality and in extreme poverty, to call for social justice. That was the first expression of what do we want to have in such an economy that we consider fair. And then we had the Bismarck reforms, social insurance systems, and so forth. In the 1920s, however, we had the hyperinflation, we had mass unemployment. So people said it's not enough that I don't have to die because of hunger, but I also want to be protected against the turmoils of the market. And then there was an increasing amount of state intervention directly intervening in the economy. And Eucken observed that this brought up a third question, and that was the question of individual freedom. He observes that left and right, with communism and fascism, the state that tried to provide that social security became ever more totalitarian and then threatened individual freedom. And that was a problem for people who cared about freedom. So when you look at what's relevant, we have justice, security, freedom, and all are important, but not everybody holds them equally dear. And what Eucken observed is that in that polarization, one force was that each party argued from a moral point of view, arguing for their value, but not respecting the values of the other opponents. And then there was an increasing polarization. You had those who put a primacy on freedom. Freedom is important. And then the idea is, oh, if the state taxes me, if the state intervenes, if the state does things to direct the economy, that's an infringement of my freedom. So those who favored freedom argued, let's have less state and more market, which is a position that was then laissez-faire. If you withdraw the state from the economy at all, that's the highest amount of freedom. But on the other hand, people said, I don't benefit from freedom if I have lost my job, if I'm unemployed. For me, justice and security have the primacy. And those voices were represented both by the left, by the socialists, but also by the right, by conservatives, who said in order to have a more just society and economy, we need more state. And that led towards calls for more intervention, towards more centrally planning and so forth. Now, what I find really interesting is if you frame the debate as such, freedom is represented by the market and justice and security is represented by the state, and you have a discussion about values that seem to be conflicting, that is a recipe for polarization. And that is what Eucken observed. And he actually then said, we do have a debate that is framed in a way that's not really productive. The question is often stated exactly as I ask you, and I apologize, it was a little bit of a trick question. Should the state do little or more? Do we need more state or do we need more market? And then you see the two different parties. You see little is what the supporters of laissez-faire say. Please get the state out of the economy. Let's have the pure market, more market. Or you have much. That is what the supporters of the economic policy of planning say. And they stand then here and say, we need a stronger state, not a stronger market. And then there are compromise solutions that try to find some sort of middle ground here. And that is actually something that is not really productive and something, how unfortunately, that we still see today. I can share with you some headlines from the COVID situation in Germany. And here again, the question is, do we need the market, Markt, or the state? That was in Wirtschaftswoche. Do we need more capitalism or more socialism? It's against a binary dichotomous choice between those perceived binary options. Now, that is actually a way in which you look at two options and frame them in a way that only allows looking at the potential conflict or a balance between the two options. But Eucken says that actually misses the point. And there was a big reflection of the experience we had in Germany at that day. Because he said, you cannot look at the state, the political order, and the economy, the market order, without acknowledging the deep interdependence. Both parts are deeply intertwined. And that was the basis then to say, okay, let's create an argument how we can construct a society and an economy that actually doesn't choose between the different values, but tries to find a way forward. So the first criticism that Eucken developed was the following. Let's talk to the people who favor laissez-faire because they favor as a value freedom. Now, if you do that, he said, you forget one important thing. If you let the market, if you leave it to its own devices, there will, and you start just by looking at the market laissez-faire, experience shows that there will be monopolies, cartels, and the accumulation of power, and that was also an experience, an historical lesson in Germany. If you have powerful groups, they will actually capture the democracy, the democratic process. They will lobby, and if they do that, they will actually have too much clout, too much say, which will spill over into diminishing freedoms for the rest of us. And that will actually lead to a sclerotic, monopolized, cartelized economy. So if you bear that in mind, for those of you who care about freedom, you want to acknowledge that you need a strong state as an arbiter that carries out antitrust policy, that arbits independent law, because otherwise you cannot safeguard the freedom in the market. If you care about freedom and freedom in the market, you should have an interest in a strong state, not a weak state. But also the other way around, for those who say we want to have security and liberty, security and justice, he said, well, if you think central planning is a good idea, let's look at what that actually means. Because if you start with central planning, you start with a political order where you need to give somebody the mandate and the coercive power to enforce the economic planning. And that actually limits freedom. But if you limit freedom and people cannot plan individually and invest and work where they know that they are best, that will actually cause uncertainty, which will lead to lower investment, lower initiative, lower prosperity, and then actually the pie will shrink. But in that system, if you have a shrinking pie, what about the distributional conflicts? If some are in power, who are in the bureaucracy, and others are not, this will actually be a source of new inequality, of corruption, of injustice. It will not be stable. And we have ample evidence from countries around the world where we've seen that actually emerge afterwards. So if you're interested in social justice and security, you should actually be interested in achieving that without limiting liberty, by actually using liberty to protect and freedom to protect social justice and security. So how can we then escape from that dichotomy if we see that both options actually don't live up to their promise? And then here comes what I did before, where you actually part from a narrow frame and ask a different question. Instead of asking what I did before, should the state do little or much? Should we have a strong state or a weak state? The problem should be put differently in order to be solvable. We have to ask a different question. So what is that question? Now for Eucken, that question is, or what he says is, whether little or more state activity, this question misses the point. It is not a quantitative, but a qualitative problem. We need to ask what kind of activity should be carried out by the state. What is the state good at? What should the state do? What the market cannot do? And what should the state focus on? And then let the market do what the market can do well. Now, Eucken has an explanation with the difference between form and process, but I would like to illustrate that with a picture you all know. And we in Germany, just as you in South Africa, one might understand, love football. And since I've talked about old white man, I thought I'd take the women's football team, because when we look at football, we can have that same distinction. When you look at a game in football, you see that the players play their moves, and that can create a beautiful game, and that's important. But sometimes we see that the game just doesn't work and doesn't live up to a fair game, because we see fouls, we see that we need certain rules, we need an arbiter, we need to make sure that if there are violations of the rules, there will be penalties. And that is something that's on a different level. And that is something that the individual player cannot provide. And this distinction between, we can look at the game where we look at the players in the game that are free to choose their moves, and the collective level where we decide what kind of rules we want to look at. that is the distinction Eugen brings forward for a concept that then later was coined the social market economy. Typically, we look at a game without acknowledging that we can distinguish between the moves of the game and then ask, should the government actually intervene in the moves? Should the government provide jobs, fix prices, produce stuff? Yes or no? That's a very different perspective on the role of the state than asking, what about the rules of the game? Who decides what's legal? What kind of incentive system we have? What rules we create and how they are enforced? That is something the individual business and employee and consumer is not good at. This is the realm of democracy where we need a strong and functional government. And then we can argue, do we want to have a political design of those rules of the game? Why is that distinction relevant? Because that distinction provides a real third option between the binary choices of laissez-faire versus socialism, centrally planned economy. Because laissez-faire means the state doesn't intervene in the moves of the game, but also leaves the markets to its own devices. There is no tuning and guidance of, thanks for sharing that screen. If you don't mind, I will just go back to my screen. And laissez-faire means we neither have political intervention in the moves nor in the rules of the game. Now, central planning socialism is saying the government does provide the jobs and fixes the prices and provides the rules. And if we combine that more smartly, we see that there are two other options. One would be despotism, where there are no rules for policies and intervention. We don't want that. But there is a more interesting option, and that is what Eugen put forward. That is the constitutional order liberalism. He calls it the competitive order. That is the blueprint for the social market economy. Let's have a strong social debate about what kind of rules move the market into a fair, just, inclusive direction, but then allow the players in the market to be individual, experiment, have decentral decision-making, and be innovative, creative, and have their freedom there.
Markus, can I interrupt you there and just ask now, how much longer before we take
It's the last slide. There's one more slide.
Right.
So I actually skipped that. So instead of asking, do we need a strong market or a strong state, the social market economy early on said, we need a stronger state, more able in terms of its capacity to be responsive to the citizens and to provide rules of the game and to enforce them. But we also need more market by then allowing competition and freedom of the players to play that game and actually let them play the game, because the players have the decentral knowledge, the players have the decentral initiative. They actually enjoy the freedom, but that freedom is also functional for society and actually for promoting then those ends of justice and growth and prosperity. Now that was last slide. There are some questions that we can debate here. It's just how can we actually move from dichotomy to synergies? How much do we actually think in terms of us versus them thinking? Or do we have a mutual understanding and acknowledgement what the state is good at, what the market is good at, what the state should be good at and the market should be good at? Do we actually have the preconditions for both sectors to fulfill their role? And what do we have to do to go there? Maybe that's the final thought to end here and then to hand over to Trevor, Manuel.
Okay, thank you, Markus. That was a lot longer than I thought, so I'm getting a bit concerned about how we're going to fit in much Q&A. But let me hand over to Trevor now for your initial reactions or responses to that, Trevor. If I can give it to you for about 5 minutes. Can Trevor be unmuted, please?
Isn't that an uncontrolled market. You've had a monopoly of a monopolization of time, and now I'm cut down from 10 to 5 minutes. Isn't that what happens if you have an uncontrolled market? And that's part of the consideration. Look, let's just start out from the fact that the social market economy grew out of a deeply traumatized Germany. And the early first half of the 20th century was exceedingly traumatic. You went through World War I, the Weimar Republic, the hyperinflation that came with that, the rise of Nazism, World War II, and the partition of Germany, and all of that had a profound impact and then opened the door for the discussion of social market economy. That I think we accept. I think that if we go on from there to some of the issues that stressed the German state post that point, and you can call it 1948, give or take, it's come up trumps. It dealt with the difficulties of post-World War II reconstruction. It dealt with the issues that followed, including the reunification and the costs of inclusion, the reunification also of the Deutschmark. Those were fairly costly enterprises. And then you moved on to a situation where the Bundesbank, which had been a formidable bastion in the fight against hyperinflation and inflation generally, was taken up in the European Central Bank with the arrival of the euro. And even post that period, there was 2009, which had a deep impact on Germany. And thereafter, I think more recently, 2015, 2016, the arrival of refugees in Germany, and 1.5 million people were let in. And I think that we must recognize that throughout all of that, the German economy grew, German prosperity grew. And as we look at life in Germany now, Germany has, if you take account of taxes, a Gini coefficient of around 0.23, which means it's substantially more equal than a country like the People's Republic of China or the United States. So I think that all those things considered, you must recognize that the social market economy has worked quite well. But there are risks, and I think it's important that we understand the point at which this was introduced and ask the question whether the social market economy is more of a cultural or cultural political phenomenon in Germany than it is pure economics. And we can come back to that in a moment. Because there are a series of features, and I think that I was very surprised by the resolute nature of people who lived through any hint of the Weimar Republic and the way in which any idea of inflation was hated. When I first got to Germany and the capital was still of the Federal Republic was still in Bonn, I tried paying for something with a credit card and was not accepted. People paid cash. All of these things are the acculturation. It's the way in which societies respond to trauma. And I think that part of what we're dealing with is that trauma. There is, of course, a big risk, and the risk is how we read ordoliberalism, the Freiburg school that came with Eucken. And it's quite important to recognize that at no point should we recognize anything akin to the efficient market hypothesis or the rational market theory. Because if you perfect markets and you don't deal with all of the issues, then I think you run a big risk. And I think that part of what we need to take out of the discussion is the fact that there is a social compact called the social market economy. And that compact, in fact, transcends political change. What you have in Germany at the moment is a grand coalition. And I think going forward, the question is, does the Social Democratic Party still exist in any shape or form and capable of building a government? Or has it all been absorbed by the power of Angela Merkel. Now, part of what you're dealing with is a situation where the situation in Germany is actually strong, and it's strong on its own. It's strong also because of the incorporation of, or Germany as part of the EU. As Chancellor Merkel says, the EU accounts for 7% of the world's population, 25% of its GDP, and 50% of its social spending. So the key issue, I think, is understanding the interrelationship with what is defined as economic choices, but actually deals with social spending, which has been the real strength of the German society. And that is the good society that we need to read. Part of what we also need to raise questions about is the ability to retain those levels of a lifestyle which is clearly amongst the highest in the world. And at the present, where you've got the demographic shift and the older population, clearly the social old age pension must be under some stress. Secondly, I think what the Germans call den Krankenkassen, the health system, is also under severe pressure because of rising costs. We've seen during COVID that the German health system responded exceedingly well, but there are massive cost pressures in the health system. Admirably, the German system has provided for a lifelong learning education system from kindergarten through schooling, the dual system, which allows for apprenticeship, and then mobility. Social mobility is a fundamentally important part of the social market economy. And then I think it's also important to recognize in a country like South Africa that Germany has enviable labor law. So I want to end this installment, Mike, with an interesting reference. Like the Seidel Foundation, there's another foundation called the Bertelsmann Stiftung in Germany, and they did a very interesting exercise. They developed an index to evaluate the social market economy. And they've taken Huygens principles, all of them, run through them, and attach scores to each of them. So there are the 7 first principles, and then you can expand this. And then they did an interesting test for robustness. Now, the country that comes out tops in terms of the evaluation of social market economies is actually Sweden. Germany comes out second. They didn't look at all of the Scandinavian countries. The Netherlands comes out third, and then the list continues there. So it's a select group of countries that they examined. The interesting issue is that Sweden coming out tops would refer to their system as social democratic, not social market. And so the operations of the state in Sweden are substantially different from those which were shaped by Huygens in the social market economy. So I think that if you look at the outcomes of now 70 years of what is called the social market economy in Germany, we must recognize that there are various attributes that have taken root in other jurisdictions elsewhere in the world. But as a system, it doesn't travel well. And it doesn't travel well because that social compact, which arose at the end of World War II, is distinctly German in its nature, and it has created a culture so that if you spoke to the Social Democratic Party, they would want more social and less market. If you spoke to the Christian Democratic Party, they might want more market and less social. So there's a broad band of agreement, but I think on the fringes of that band, there are political party choices as well. And I think that it's all of that that makes it hard to look at transposing the German experience immediately into South Africa. Let me stop there. I'd like to come back on some of the constitutional and governance issues as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Thanks for keeping to the time there as well. Markus, your second contribution, we have to be very sensitive about the time because there's a lot of people that are wanting to participate. So if I could ask you to keep it as short as possible, please.
Yes. Well, thanks, Trevor, Manuel, for the excellent comments. You pointed out that in Germany we have a much richer discussion about what the social market economy actually means, depending on the left and the right. And this is actually where I want to continue, because I do think that we share many, many very similar debates, be it in Sweden, Netherlands, Germany, that relate to what you just said. If you look at the German market economy in its actually evolvement over time, you see that it started in the 50s and 60s. But if you ask people in Germany, do you think that economic distribution by and large is just and fair, just or unjust, you actually see that there is an ongoing debate how much social fabric we actually see in the social market economy. This is interesting because, as you also said, we do have a strong increase in the sum spent on social programs. You see that there is an absolute increase, which is quite interesting, but also in relative terms, the share of the GDP spent on social programs is rising, also for the reasons you mentioned, demographic change, Trevor. So that actually brings up what is the prospect of developing the social market economy forward in the future, and what are the questions here? And again, I'm interested not in one specific policy proposal, but in the way that debate is very often framed. Also, sometimes when you compare different countries. I'm skipping the interaction with you. I would like to go back to Müller-Armack, who can be seen as giving testimony to one idea of how to interpret what to make of that social market economy once you live in it. He wrote, "The ideal of the social market economy is not limited to merely empowering the tools of competition in a socially useful way. Moreover, the market-based process of income generation provides a stable fundament for the government to redistribute income and to correct the income distribution." So a second element that I hadn't talked about before is, what is the role of social policy, redistribution? How do we think of the welfare state? And here, what I want to show you is that we have options to think about various frames of how we make sense of that. One way is to say, well, we have redistribution and actually takes money from the rich and gives it to the poor. But that is then very often a discussion where we see a social market economy as more social if we have more redistribution, and less social if we have less redistribution. Now, redistribution is important to take care of people who are left behind. But if we think that we do that as something that is against the market, which is very often the more leftist conception, let's take a lot of money, intervene that way in the market, and then shift it into social purposes, that's only one option. Because what we can also do is, and I will focus on the fourth issue, is to ask, okay, can we use social policies as some form of exchange that makes everybody better off? And I'm saying that because you talked about a compact before, the social compact, and one idea of a social compact is that everybody can say, I agree to that. So how can we make sure that we have social policies that do not create winners or losers, but actually create a sense of, this is better for us as society? And one way to think about that is to look at social policies that are actually not against the market, but help the market, social policies for the market. And if we ask that question and depart from that question, how much do we spend on welfare programs, we should rather ask, what do we actually do with it? Not how much money do we spend, but what do we achieve with it, for whom, and is that productive? And I want to share 3 ways this can be productive. One, instead of focusing on ex-ante policies, where people are left behind and then compensate then, we can try to make sure that nobody gets left behind in the first place. One example from education is everybody will agree that education is important and we should do more for education. But even in education, it makes a huge difference whether you look at early childhood education before people actually have disparities, or try to help people who are left behind in their later age. In their later age, it's actually quite expensive to do that, and then social policies have a return on investment that is lower than the money we invest. If we do the social policies in terms of educating the people when they're early on, educating those who are most distant from education actually has the highest value. So if we do it properly, instead of looking at how much money we spend, we can spend it in a way that actually has a dividend for everybody. And that is the idea, not to ask, what can we do for the poor once they are excluded, but how can we invest in removing the barriers that create the exclusion in the first place? Now, you mentioned health insurance. Health is also an issue where we have to, we're investing more, but we can also look at it as from a perspective where we see externalities being compensated. In the COVID crisis, we saw that if you pay for the testing, for example, people will do more testing, and that's not only good for that individual person, but for society at large. It will save money also for others. So if we invest for education for everybody, there will be a dividend for everybody. The same is true for education. Are there positive externalities of our education? Of course, if we have talented people, it's not only good for the people who receive the training, but also for others. The same goes for community safety. The same goes, for example, now that we have the furlough. If we allow companies not to lay off people too quickly, it's actually good for everybody else if we can avoid a too disruptive break in the economy by those means. Finally, when we look at the market, social policies can also unleash risk productivity. And that's a very different framing than to say, how can we redistribute wealth? We can ask, how can we make the allocation of talent in a way that it's more entrepreneurial, and safety insurance can actually, and social insurance can play a role here. If you take an artist on the left side and an artist on the right side here, and the artist on the left side has a safety net, and the other one would crash on a concrete floor, and you give them a year to practice beautiful figures, what do you expect who will be more impressive? And you will see if we provide certain forms of insurance, it can actually build up productivity. So that's a different way to think about the social perspective. It's not about hamstringing the market by taking away money in a way that it will actually stifle investment, that will reduce initiative, but about actually increasing initiative. And one way to illustrate that is to look at a racing car. If you look at a racing car and ask yourself, what is the function of a brake in a racing car? You will actually see a brake is necessary for a car to be able to drive faster. And that's counterintuitive, because you think a brake slows you down, but if you have a brake in a racing car, you can actually have faster rounds. And smart social policies equally, if you design them, shouldn't hamstring the market, but actually unleash the market. And that's easily said, but not easily done, because very often in social policy, also in Germany, we see that you start a brake with good intention, but it can jam, and then it can actually leave you behind. So what we can take away from that is not a blueprint in terms of policy, but questions that I think can travel beyond also cultural debates.
Markus,
and that is to say—
Can I just interrupt you again there? We've had another 10 minutes there, and we're starting to get very close towards the time when we must open for questions. And I know Trevor has some responses to make. So can I hand over to Trevor now for a couple of minutes, and then we'll open it up.
Thank you very much, Mike. let me just emphasize, if I didn't do so sufficiently, that in the previous slide presentation, Markus was suggesting that these are binary choices between state and market. And I think we must disabuse ourselves of that. For some of the reasons that he said, but aren't amplified on the slides. And let me just go back to what Adam Smith said about the competition in the absence of any controls leads to excesses. Now, just pause for a moment and look at the IT systems and look at the development of monopolies such as Microsoft, Facebook, Apple, and Amazon. And there aren't any controls unless Donald Trump wakes up one morning and says, I don't like TikTok because it's owned by Chinese. We haven't found a way of managing these kinds of issues. Now, if you amplify that same point across all kinds of markets, you will realize that there's difficulty. I think that the big issue in Germany is actually the strength of the parliament. The Bundestag is fundamentally important in providing a balance and exercising oversight over the executive. And within the Bundestag and that arrangement, the Federal Court of Audit plays a fundamentally important role. And that is not insignificant in the context of South Africa. In South Africa, we framed what we consider to be the best constitution in the world. And I know that three of my peers who participated in the Constitutional Assembly are on this call. Ruth Meyer, Leon Wessels, and Ken Andrew. And so if you look at the preamble to our Constitution, it makes the commitments. The question that we have to answer is why those commitments, such as raising the living standards of all citizens and freeing the potential of each person, or building an open society where all are equally protected by law, why those have not been realized. And that, I think, becomes an important discussion. It's a pre-discussion, because if anything, apartheid left South Africa's market conditions totally distorted. The majority were excluded, and that is why our struggle for democracy was as important as it was. And what we thought we would put in place, including a set of proposals to bring Black people into economic ownership, have now created all manner of distortions. And part of that is because the countervailing power that you need is absent. I think that in the German context, it's not just the party, it's also the countervailing power of the Bundestag and the way in which they push back against excesses. And my concern in South Africa is, notwithstanding the design of our constitution, our parliament, our legislatures across the board are too weak. Let me not express a view about who was included in one of our provincial legislatures yesterday in KwaZulu-Natal. Let me not be drawn into that right now. But our legislatures are too weak, and this, you've seen the collapse of local government, and that has a profound impact on the lived experience of people, water, sanitation, access to sports facilities, all of the things that are exclusively the domain of local government have collapsed because of poor governance. You move up from that, the provincial governments have always been in the parlous state, and they're still fairly young. Our constitution was only crafted, agreed to in May of 1996, signed off by the Constitutional Court in 97. So it's still fairly young. Those 9 provinces were created, but they face enormous stresses and strains. And if you look at national government, with the best will in the world, the legislature, our National Assembly, and National Council of Provinces are actually too weak to exercise oversight. One of the things we took from Germany was a proportional representation system, and this creates an inbuilt difficulty because the very same people who should be exercising oversight would like to be brought up into the executive. Now, Germany has dealt with this by having a joint system of representation, so you have both first past the post and PR. But we have difficulties. I think that with the best will in the world, beyond the the stated intent, and again, I go back to the preamble, the founding provisions of our Constitution, non-racism and non-sexism. And you look at things like gender-based violence at the moment, you look at the extent of racism that applies in South Africa, you look at our Bill of Rights, and then all of our Constitution. It's immensely strong, but it requires oversight. And that oversight is, in fact, the elected representatives of the people in legislatures, and that isn't happening. And the consequence is the kind of sense that we are doddering along, and that we may be doddering towards a failed state. And so I want to end by saying that the big challenge is not the inherent strengths of the social market economy, as it's called. I believe that it's more cultural than pure economic. It takes out the econometrics from the situation. It's a cultural development in Germany, but the maintenance thereof is the strength of the institutions, the trust that the populace have in the institutions, and the maintenance of that culture. And if anything, we did not utilize the trauma that we lived through under apartheid, the transition to democracy, which created an opportunity for us to learn from the German experience right there and then, and take it forward very strongly. But the question, I think, that arises now is whether we can reconstruct the social compact, what people expect to give up, what people expect to gain, and whether, as Hans Buehler raised at the beginning, whether COVID-19 presents an opportunity to rethink the social compact. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Trevor.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this morning, and to our two speakers for so very ably leading the conversation. I think the important benefit that we've all derived from this is that we live in a moment when we desperately need ideas, we need political will, and we need the courage to bring those two together. And our hope is always that part of the reason we provide these platforms is that that will happen. We, not only in this country, but around the world, need a very different imagination. And we need to greater resolve to allow that imagination to leap into actions. Just yesterday, and because we are the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office, just yesterday, Pope Francis spoke about the need to support those economies that are profoundly inclusive. He was speaking about a post-COVID world, and he said, we need to support those economies that are profoundly inclusive, that are deeply respectful of the environment, and that go to the margins to listen to what is often thought of as the weakest, and to interpret policy through the hermeneutic that they provide. And I think part of what we want is a discussion that allows those hopes, those dreams to be realized. So we're deeply grateful to both the speakers, we're deeply grateful to the organization, to Hans Seidel Foundation, to our own staff, but to those who participated for being part of this discussion. And I do hope that we will have the opportunity to continue these rich debates for the good of all, our country, but also our world. So again, thank you so very, very much, and I wish you well for the rest of the day and all that lies ahead. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Peter John. Hans Buehler, do you want to say anything in closing?
Thank you, Mike. All I can say, it's 11:30 and I'm German, so we have to close. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating. Trevor, Manuel, thank you. Markus, thank you very much for the valuable inputs. And especially, I think also thank you to all participants for commenting in this chat box. Interesting, valuable, I think sometimes also quite direct comments, which we should all read, and especially the decision makers in this call should read and take to heart. And I think it's worth to have these exchanges. There is no blueprint, as Trevor, Manuel said, but I think it's exactly the right time in South Africa to create new ideas. And we will do this in the future as well. Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Pater Peter John.
Good. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have recorded the session. We will be creating a video and a podcast of the two main presentations of Professor Beckmann, Mr. Manuel, not of your discussions. And we will circulate the links to those once they are available, probably sometime next week. We have also put on the chat box the abstract that Professor Beckmann prepared, and I'm hoping that he will allow us also to share his slide presentation with you. And in that way, some of the richness of what was shared today can be absorbed at your leisure as well. And we will make a point of contacting you all again the next time that we try to address this kind of a topic. So from my side, once again, thank you everyone and have a lovely day.